From the mid-1980s to the late 90s, the NBA was dominated by the infamous Michael Jordan. He had many players that could have probably been considered his rival, but in reality, Michael dominated all of their matchups, making these quote rivalries one-sided. But there was one particular player that was destined to give him a run for his money. In 1986, the Boston Celtics were at the top of their game, finishing the year with a record of 67-15. In the first round of the playoffs that year, they managed to sweep Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls out of the playoffs. The Celtics eventually won the championship, and 9 days after their victory, they got a stroke of luck when they drafted the best player in college basketball, Len Bias, with the number 2 pick in the draft. Bias was added to an already all-time great roster that was starting to age, and his youth was supposed to extend the lifespan of the Celtics dynasty by several years. He already had some memorable matchups in college against MJ, and with his superstar talent, he was bound to serve as a formidable opponent to the seemingly unstoppable Michael Jordan, which would have changed 90s NBA basketball as we all know it. Unfortunately, just 2 days after Bias was drafted, things would come to a screeching halt. Leonard Kevin Bias was born on November 18, 1963 in Landover, Maryland. He was born to parents James Bias Jr., who was an electrical repairman, and Dr. Lonnie Bias, who was a bank employee. Len was the oldest child and had 4 younger siblings, Michelle, Jay, and Eric Bias. Len started his basketball journey playing at the Columbia Park Rec Center in Landover, which was just a few blocks away from where he lived, and there he would receive his first bit of coaching. One of his first coaches, Wharton Lee Madkins, who was also the director of the rec center, said that when Bias was young, other kids used to laugh at him when he would try to play basketball. They would never want him on their team, but that quickly switched to everybody wanting him to play with them. He began to take basketball seriously in 8th grade, and he would take his talents to Northwestern High School in Hyattsville. He wasn't an impact player right away, but his hard work was noticeable. According to his coaches, his one flaw was that he used to avoid contact. His high school coach Bob Wagner said, "When I think of Len, I don't think of how great he was in games. It's about watching him in practice, because it was in practice that you could see how hard he worked to get to the level that he was at." He would develop into one of the best players in his region, and by his senior season, Bias averaged 20 points and 12 rebounds while shooting 68% from the field. He wasn't heavily recruited by colleges, but managed to secure a scholarship with his hometown University of Maryland.
And here is where his college career began, and he would put himself on the national stage.
Before his college career started, Bias played in the infamous Urban Coalition League in Washington, which was made up of mostly college players and some local NBA players, and Bias dominated, averaging 36 points per game. His talent was evident, but he was still a raw prospect, and his freshman season was pretty uneventful, averaging 7.1 points per game. His sophomore season is when he began to shine, averaging 15.3 points, making a name for himself in a game against the University of North Carolina on January 12, 1984, where he would go head-to-head against junior Michael Jordan, where Jordan scored 21 and secured the win, but the young Bias managed to outplay him and scored 24. Maybe a sign of things to come? Once his junior season hit, Bias began to hit his stride as a player. He averaged almost 19 a game and almost 7 rebounds, and he took home the 1985 ACC Player of the Year and was voted second-team All-American. If there was any doubt that Len Bias was the best player in college basketball, his senior season quieted all of that doubt when he came in averaging 23.2 points per game, won his second straight ACC Player of the Year award, and was a consensus first-team All-American. There wasn't a single player in the country that could stop him, and he solidified himself as one of the best college players of all time. After an illustrious college career, it was time for Bias to enter the NBA draft and make all of his dreams come true. NBA scouts loved this game, and Bias was a surefire top pick in the draft. He looked to be a player that could rival NBA great Michael Jordan for years to come. Standing at 6'8" and 210 pounds with a long wingspan, Bias had a level of athleticism that was unheard of, with people saying that he was able to jump high enough to grab quarters off the top of the backboard. Aside from his physical gifts, he had a great outside shot and attacked the rim like no other player his size had ever done before, and he finished anytime he wanted to. One Celtics scout said that Bias was the closest thing to Michael Jordan that he's seen in a while. On June 17, 1986, when the NBA draft came around in Madison Square Garden, Bias was arguably the best player available, but the Cavs had the number 1 pick and they needed a center, so they selected Brad Daugherty from the University of North Carolina. The Celtics, who were already one of the best teams in the league and had just won a championship less than 2 weeks prior, had the number 2 pick thanks to a trade the year before where they traded guard Gerald Henderson to the Seattle Supersonics for their first-round pick, which the Celtics are about to cash in on. With the second pick of the 1986 NBA draft, the Boston Celtics selected forward Len Bias out of Maryland. He finally made it. It was a dream come true. From the time he spent at the Columbia Park Rec Center to the 4 years he spent honing his game at Maryland, this was the ultimate goal. All of his hard work paid off. Bias was now in a position to provide for his whole family and change their lives forever. But soon, things would tragically take a turn for the worse. On June 18, 1986, a day after being drafted, Bias and his father James flew to Boston for a ceremony where he would be introduced to the Celtics coaches and management staff, and where he would have discussions with Reebok to negotiate a 5-year, $1.6 million endorsement deal. The marketing department felt like Bias can do for them what Michael Jordan did for Nike. Things are moving fast for the future superstar. That same day, Bias and his father flew back home to Maryland, arriving to their family home at about 11 p.m. At midnight, he went back to the Maryland campus where he and his teammates ate dinner. He hung with friends at his campus until approximately 2 a.m. the morning of June 19th, when he left and went to an off-campus gathering to continue to celebrate his accomplishment and return to his dorm at about 3 a.m. For the next 3 to 4 hours, Bias, a few of his teammates, and his good friend Brian Tribble all continued to celebrate, but they seemingly celebrated a little too hard. Sometime after 6 a.m., in the middle of a conversation with teammate Terry Long, Bias reportedly began to have a seizure and collapsed on the floor. At 6:32 a.m., Tribble called 911 and they arrived at 6:36, but all attempts to revive Bias were unsuccessful, and at 8:55 a.m., Len Bias had officially passed away due to cardiac arrhythmia related to drug usage. He was 22 years old. Bias's funeral was held on June 23rd, and over 11,000 people attended. This was a big loss for his family and his community alike. Bias's big smile and charming personality was a staple in the state of Maryland, as his neighbors remembered him as someone who gave the local children a lot of attention and encouraged them to stay in school and to spend as much time studying as they did playing sports. His hard work inspired others and let them know that they could do whatever it was that they put their minds to. Len Bias was a local hero, and losing him shook the community to its core. Soon after, somebody had to be held accountable for this tragic situation. Over the next few days and weeks, details of Bias's death began to leak. At the hospital, they found traces of cocaine in his system, and investigators began to slowly piece together what happened that night. 1 month later, Brian Tribble was indicted on charges of possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. Bias's teammates, Terry Long and David Gregg, were also charged with possession, along with the obstruction of justice, leading to them being suspended from the team. Long and Gregg's charges were dropped in exchange for their testimony against Tribble, but a year later, on June 3, 1987, Tribble was acquitted on all charges relating to Bias's death. Convicted or not, the damage was done, and the NBA lost a rising star before he could ever play a single minute. The basketball world was devastated, but this situation was bigger than basketball. Bias's death shook up the nation and highlighted a big drug problem that was plaguing the nation during the 1980s. After his passing, President Ronald Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 that would provide a mandatory minimum prison sentence of 20 years for any case of drug distribution that led to the death or serious injury of a person. The law was named the Len Bias Law. America was at the peak of his drug problem, and it reflected in the NBA. Including Len Bias, the 1986 draft class alone had 4 of their top 10 picks' careers hampered by drug usage. The number 3 pick, Chris Washburn, and the number 7 pick, Roy Tarpley, were both banned from the league for excessive drug usage, and the number 6 pick, William Bedford, served a few suspensions and spent significant time in prison due to drug offenses. Commissioner David Stern saw that there was clearly a problem, and he knew he had to do something so that a situation like what happened to Len Bias doesn't happen ever again, so he created the NBA drug policy that enforced strict punishments anytime a player was caught doing any type of drugs. The story of Len Bias has been used as a cautionary tale for years. He was known as a hard worker with great physical abilities that was destined for greatness. He went from a skinny kid that shied away from contact to a grown man that terrorized his defenders whenever he stepped onto the floor. He may have been a product of the era he was in, but he didn't seem like he would be the one to be caught in the situation. Len had a quiet demeanor who rarely ever even had a drink, so nobody expected this outcome. But this goes to show that one quick decision and the people you surround yourself with can change everything. His legacy still lives on as he was inducted into the NBA Hall of Fame in the class of 2021. His mother, Dr. Len Bias, is now a motivational speaker and an anti-drug advocate that travels to different communities and speaks to young men and women about the dangers of drug use and continues to keep the memory of her son alive. A quote from his mother reads, "I believe that Len was a seed that went down into the ground to bring forth life. And as a result of his death, a heightened awareness came about substance abuse. When this thing happens to such an athlete that's on top of the world, and is snatched away by something that is ravishing our country, then people will remember it because it was a shock." This couldn't be any truer. Bias's death was impactful because of who he was, what he did, and how he died. It highlighted the issue of drug use in the United States and serves as a reminder that nobody is invincible. That's all for today, guys. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. There's plenty of different stories that this channel is going to cover, and you're not going to want to miss them.